The meeting lasted 11 minutes. That is what the diplomatic cables said afterward. 11 minutes for what was supposed to be a 2-hour negotiation session between the United States Trade Representative and China's Vice Premier in a hotel conference room in Geneva 3 weeks ago. The American delegation arrived with a folder thick with demands: tariff reductions, intellectual property guarantees, structural reforms to state subsidies, market access commitments. They laid it all on the table, and according to one person in the room, the Chinese side did not even open the folder. The vice premier looked across the table, smiled politely, and said in Mandarin, "We have reviewed your proposals. They are not acceptable." Then he stood up, shook hands, and left. 11 minutes. The Americans sat there in stunned silence. What you just witnessed was not a failed negotiation. It was a funeral. The funeral for 40 years of assumptions about how China behaves, about how power works, about who gets to write the rules of the global economy. And if you do not understand what died in that room, you will not understand what is about to happen next. Because the trade war you think you know, the one about tariffs and soybeans and intellectual property theft, that is not the real war. The real war is about whether the United States will accept that it is no longer the only superpower that matters. And China just sent its answer. Let me take you back to understand how we got here, because the story you have been told about the US-China relationship is incomplete. For most of modern history, China's interactions with the West have been defined by a brutal asymmetry. China was weak, the West was strong. And in that power imbalance, China learned a single survival skill. It learned to bend. In the 19th century, when British warships appeared off the coast of China demanding trade concessions, demanding the right to sell opium to Chinese citizens, China had no navy that could resist. So it signed the unequal treaties. It gave away Hong Kong. It opened 5 treaty ports where foreigners could live under their own laws, immune to Chinese jurisdiction. It paid reparations for the crime of trying to defend itself. And when Chinese officials tried to resist, the British and French armies marched into Beijing in 1860, looted the emperor's summer palace, and burned it to the ground. Not because they needed to, but because they could. Because the message had to be clear. You are weak. We are strong. You will do what we say. That memory, that humiliation, is not ancient history to China. It is the psychological foundation of everything that has happened since. When Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace in 1949 and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, he was speaking directly to that wound. But Mao's China was still weak. His utopian experiments, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, nearly destroyed the country. Tens of millions died. The economy collapsed. By the late 1970s, China was desperate. And so Deng Xiaoping, the man who would reshape China, did something that required extraordinary pragmatism and extraordinary humility. He went to the West with his hat in his hand. He went to the United States, to Japan, to Europe, and he made a deal. The deal was simple and explicit. You give us technology, investment, and access to your markets. In return, we will give you cheap labor, a stable manufacturing base, political stability, and we will play by your rules. We will join your institutions, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. We will accept your intellectual property laws, your environmental standards, your trade frameworks, at least on paper. We will not challenge your dominance. We will integrate into your system quietly, patiently, obediently. And for 40 years, that deal held. China became the world's factory. It made your shoes, your electronics, your furniture, your toys, your steel, your chemicals. It swallowed the pollution. It swallowed the low wages. It swallowed the dangerous working conditions. It accepted sweating in factories for dollars a day so that Americans could buy cheap flat-screen TVs and Europeans could furnish their homes at IKEA. China had no leverage, so it had no choice. It needed the West. It needed the capital. It needed the technology. It needed the export markets to employ its hundreds of millions of rural migrants flooding into the cities. And the West benefited enormously. American corporations made fortunes. Walmart's business model depended on Chinese manufacturing. Apple's profit margins depended on Chinese assembly lines. Consumers across the developed world enjoyed a decades-long decline in the price of goods. Investors enjoyed high returns. Yes, some factory workers in Ohio and Michigan and North Carolina lost their jobs, but the elites in Washington and Wall Street and Silicon Valley were thriving. The overall system worked beautifully for the people in power. And China was patient. It took the technology, it studied it, it copied it, it reverse-engineered it, it stole some of it, it improved on it, it saved relentlessly. It invested in infrastructure, in education, in research. And slowly, factory by factory, deal by deal, patent by patent, it built itself into something the West had not anticipated. It built itself into a peer competitor. Now fast forward to today, to 2025. The asymmetry is gone. China is no longer the supplicant at the table begging for favors. It is the world's largest trading nation. It is the largest manufacturer by far. It is the largest holder of foreign exchange reserves. It holds over $1 trillion of American government debt. It dominates the global supply chains for batteries, for solar panels, for electric vehicles, for rare earth minerals, for pharmaceuticals, for consumer electronics. It is the largest trading partner of over 120 countries, including most of America's closest allies. Germany trades more with China than with the United States. Australia's economy depends on Chinese demand for iron ore and coal. Southeast Asia is economically intertwined with China in ways that cannot be undone. And here is the part that Washington has not fully absorbed, has not fully internalized, has not fully accepted. China does not need the United States the way it used to. Yes, it still benefits from trade with America. Yes, it still wants access to advanced semiconductors, to cutting-edge software, to certain technologies where the U.S. still leads. But it is no longer dependent in the existential sense. It has options. It has alternative markets. It has a domestic consumer base of 1.4 billion people that is growing wealthier. It has the Belt and Road Initiative, which has spread its economic influence across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. It has built parallel institutions to challenge the Western-dominated order, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Coalition, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And most critically, most dangerously for the United States, China has confidence. The psychological shift is more important than the economic shift. For the first time in 200 years, since the Opium Wars shattered its self-image, China believes it does not have to accept terms dictated by the West. It believes it can say no and survive. It believes it can push back and win. And that belief, that confidence, is what you saw in that 11-minute meeting in Geneva. It is what you are seeing now as the trade war enters what American officials are quietly, nervously calling the critical phase. Because this is not 2018 anymore. This is not the first round of the trade war when China was caught off guard and scrambled to respond. This time, China is ready. This time, China is dug in. And this time, China has decided that bending is more dangerous than standing firm. Here is what happened in the months leading up to that meeting, the context that explains why China chose confrontation over compromise. In late 2024, the United States imposed a new round of tariffs on Chinese goods, this time specifically targeting electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and solar panels. The official justification was unfair subsidies. The real reason was fear. American car manufacturers were getting destroyed. Chinese electric vehicles were not just cheaper, they were better. They were packed with advanced software, with autonomous driving features, with battery technology that offered longer range and faster charging. They made American cars look like relics from the 2010s, outdated and overpriced. Ford, General Motors, even Tesla in some markets were losing ground. And the American auto industry, which still employs millions of people and still has enormous political influence, especially in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, went to Washington and demanded protection. So the Biden administration acted. But the tariffs were not enough. The pressure campaign went further. Washington wanted structural changes. It wanted China to stop subsidizing its state-owned enterprises. It wanted China to open its financial services sector to American banks and insurance companies. It wanted China to stop using industrial policy, the government-directed strategy of picking winner industries and pouring resources into them to dominate emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. In other words, Washington wanted China to stop being China. It wanted China to abandon the economic model that had made it successful. It wanted China to dismantle the system that had lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years. And American negotiators genuinely believed that if they applied enough pressure, if they threatened enough tariffs, if they rallied enough allies, if they cut off enough access to technology, China would come to the table and compromise. They believed this because it had always worked before. In the 1990s, when the United States threatened to revoke China's most favored nation trading status unless it improved its human rights record, China made symbolic concessions. It released a few dissidents. It signed some agreements. The trade relationship continued. In the 2000s, when the United States accused China of manipulating its currency to make its exports artificially cheap, China let the yuan appreciate gradually. Not as much as Washington wanted, but enough to ease the pressure. In 2015, when the United States confronted China over cyber espionage, over Chinese government hackers stealing trade secrets from American companies, China signed an agreement pledging to stop hacking for commercial purposes. The hacking slowed, at least for a while. The pattern was consistent and clear. The United States applied pressure. China resisted briefly. Negotiations happened. China made concessions. The crisis passed. Both sides declared victory. The relationship moved forward. This was the established rhythm of U.S.-China relations for decades. Tension, negotiation, compromise, reset. The Americans expected the same pattern to hold. But this time, China did not compromise. It did not even pretend to negotiate seriously. It rejected the American demands outright, immediately, and bluntly, and then it retaliated with precision and force. Within days of the American tariffs taking effect, China announced its own countermeasures, and these were not random or symbolic. These were calculated to inflict maximum pain on American political vulnerabilities. China restricted the export of rare earth elements, the critical minerals that are essential for everything from smartphones to electric car batteries to guided missiles. China controls over 70% of global rare earth production and over 90% of refining capacity. The message was clear. You want to cut us off from technology? We can cut you off from the materials you need to build that technology. China launched an antitrust investigation into American tech companies operating in China, specifically targeting their data practices and market dominance. Apple, Qualcomm, Microsoft, all of them suddenly faced regulatory scrutiny that could result in billions in fines or even expulsion from the Chinese market. China suspended agricultural purchases from key swing states in the United States. It stopped buying soybeans from Iowa. It stopped buying pork from North Carolina. It stopped buying wheat from Kansas. These were not the largest sources of Chinese food imports. China could buy from Brazil, from Argentina, from Australia, but they were states that mattered in American presidential elections. The message was clear. You want to play politics with trade? We can play that game too. And here is the critical point, the detail that reveals how much has changed. These were not panicked reactions. These were not improvised responses thrown together in a crisis. These were moves that China had been preparing for years. China had spent the last decade quietly and systematically reducing its vulnerabilities. It had diversified its supply chains so it was less dependent on any single country. It had built up strategic reserves of food, energy, and critical materials. It had poured hundreds of billions of dollars into domestic technology development to reduce its dependence on American semiconductors, American software, American patents. It had created alternative systems in finance, in communications, in trade, so that if the West tried to cut it off, it could survive. It had turned itself into a fortress economy, not isolated or autarkic like the Soviet Union, but resilient and defensible. And the result is that China can now withstand pressure in ways it could not have in 2008 or even 2015. It can absorb economic pain. It can retaliate effectively. It can outlast the United States in a war of attrition. And Chinese leaders believe this. They believe they are stronger than the Americans realize. The American business community understands this, and they are terrified, though they will not say so publicly because criticizing U.S.-China policy is politically dangerous. But in private conversations, in closed-door meetings, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are telling officials in Washington that the trade war is unsustainable. They are saying that decoupling from China is not just economically costly, it is functionally impossible. They are saying that their supply chains are too deeply integrated, their factories too dependent on Chinese suppliers, their future growth too reliant on access to the Chinese market. Apple assembles most of its products in China. Even as it tries to diversify to India and Vietnam, the most critical components still come from Chinese suppliers, and the speed and skill of Chinese manufacturing cannot be replicated elsewhere, not quickly, not cheaply. Tesla's most efficient factory, the one that produces cars faster and cheaper than any other Tesla plant in the world, is in Shanghai. Elon Musk has said repeatedly that the quality and speed of Chinese manufacturing is unmatched. Boeing needs Chinese buyers. China is the largest aviation market in the world, and if Chinese airlines stop buying Boeing planes and buy only from Europe's Airbus or from China's own Comac, Boeing's business model collapses. Caterpillar, the American heavy machinery giant, gets a quarter of its revenue from China. General Motors sells more cars in China than in the United States. Intel, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, all of the major American semiconductor companies derive a huge percentage of their revenue from the Chinese market. Starbucks has more stores in China than in any country except the United States. Nike's future growth depends on Chinese consumers. If China retaliates, if it truly closes the door to American companies, these corporations do not just lose revenue, they lose their competitive edge globally. Because here is the secret, the uncomfortable truth that the business world knows, but the political world refuses to accept. China is no longer just a market. It is no longer just a cheap manufacturing base. It is a laboratory. It is the place where the future is being built. The competition there is so intense, the pace of innovation so fast, the consumer expectations so high, that companies that leave China risk becoming obsolete. If you want to understand the future of electric vehicles, you have to be in Shenzhen, watching BYD and NIO and XPeng iterate on designs every 6 months. If you want to understand mobile payments, digital wallets, super apps, you have to be in Hangzhou, studying Alibaba and Tencent. If you want to understand advanced manufacturing, automation, robotics, you have to be in Guangdong, where factories are being transformed into smart facilities that can customize products at scale. China is not the cheap factory anymore. It is the frontier. It is the place where companies go to get fit, to learn, to adapt, to survive. And American companies know this. But American politicians do not care, or they care about something else entirely. They care about voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania who lost their jobs when the factories moved to China. They care about the defense hawks in the Pentagon and the intelligence community who see China as a military threat, who worry about Taiwan, who worry about the South China Sea, who worry about Chinese espionage and cyber warfare. They care about the ideologues, both on the left and the right, who believe that the Chinese Communist Party is a totalitarian regime, an existential enemy of freedom, a threat to human rights, and a model that must not be allowed to succeed because if it does, it will prove that democracy is not the only path to prosperity. And so the political class in Washington, both Democrats and Republicans, is united in pushing for decoupling, for reshoring, for friend-shoring, for anything that reduces American dependence on China. They are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing through the CHIPS Act. They are subsidizing battery production and green energy. They are pressuring allies in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea to join the effort, to restrict technology exports to China, to reduce their own dependence on Chinese supply chains. They are building a coalition to contain China economically and technologically. And they genuinely believe this strategy will work. They believe that if they can deny China access to the most advanced technologies, if they can strangle its tech sector, if they can isolate it diplomatically, China's growth will stall, its economy will stumble, and its political system will face a crisis of legitimacy. They believe that the Chinese people, especially the educated urban middle class, will eventually demand political reform, demand democracy, demand freedom. They believe that the Communist Party's grip on power is fragile, and that economic pressure will expose that fragility. This is the theory. This is the hope. This is the bet that Washington is making. But here is what they are missing: the fatal flaw in the strategy. China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was isolated, cut off from the global economy by choice and by necessity. It tried to build a self-sufficient autarkic system, producing everything domestically, and it failed because it could not keep up with the technological dynamism and economic efficiency of the West. It could not innovate fast enough. It could not provide its citizens with a rising standard of living. And when the gap between the promise of communism and the reality of life became undeniable, the system collapsed. But China is different. China is embedded in the global economy in ways the Soviet Union never was. It is the central node, the critical hub, in global supply chains. It is not trying to isolate itself. It is trying to dominate the networks. You cannot isolate China without isolating yourself. When the United States bans the export of advanced semiconductors and the equipment needed to make them to China, China does not collapse. It does not give up. It doubles down on domestic research and development. It pours tens of billions of dollars into its own semiconductor industry. It recruits scientists and engineers from Taiwan, from South Korea, from the United States, offering them higher salaries and better research facilities. It steals intellectual property. It copies designs. It reverse engineers technology. And within a few years, it starts producing chips that are not cutting edge, not the most advanced 3-nanometer or 2-nanometer processors that power the latest iPhones, but good enough. Good enough for cars. Good enough for consumer electronics. Good enough for most applications. And that closes the gap enough to survive. When the United States tries to convince European countries to ban Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, from their 5G networks, citing security concerns, some countries comply, Britain, Sweden, others do not. Germany vacillates. Many developing countries ignore the pressure entirely because Huawei's technology is cheaper, sometimes better, and comes with financing that Western companies cannot match. And because many countries do not want to be forced to choose sides. They want to trade with everyone. They want access to Chinese markets and American technology. They do not want a new Cold War that forces them into rival blocs. When the United States pressures allies to stop using Chinese-made cranes in their ports because of fears that they could be used for espionage, the allies nod politely and then quietly continue using them because there are no alternatives at the same price and quality. Chinese companies like ZPMC control over 70% of the global market for port cranes. Replacing them would cost billions and take years. The world is not neatly divided into two camps the way it was during the Cold War, capitalist West versus communist East. It is messier, more interconnected, more multipolar. And that interconnection gives China leverage. It gives China options. It gives China the ability to resist American pressure in ways the Soviet Union never could. And this brings us back to that 11-minute meeting in Geneva, to the moment when China looked at the folder of American demands and said no. Why did China make that choice? Why did it choose confrontation over compromise, especially when compromise had always worked before, when bending had always been the safer strategy? There are multiple reasons, and they all point to the same conclusion. China believes it can win. First, China looks at the American political system and sees chaos, dysfunction, and short-term thinking. It sees a country that cannot agree on basic policy, a Congress that is paralyzed by partisan gridlock, a political culture that is poisoned by polarization. It sees an election system where the White House changes hands every 4 or 8 years, and with it the entire strategic direction of the country. It sees Trump impose tariffs, Biden keep those tariffs and add more, and it knows that the next administration, whether in 2028 or later, might do something completely different. There is no consistency. There is no long-term strategy that survives beyond a single presidency. China sees this as weakness, as a structural disadvantage that it can exploit. In contrast, China's political system is stable, at least in the short to medium term. Xi Jinping has consolidated power in a way that no Chinese leader has since Mao Zedong. He has removed term limits on the presidency. He has purged rivals and potential challengers. He has centralized decision-making authority. Whether you think this is good governance or authoritarian overreach is beside the point. The point is that China can make long-term plans and stick to them. It does not have to worry about midterm elections or opposition parties blocking legislation. It can commit to a strategy and execute it over decades. And in a contest of wills, in a war of attrition, the ability to think long-term and stay committed is a decisive advantage. Second, China looks at the American economy and sees vulnerabilities. Yes, the U.S. economy is still larger in nominal terms. Yes, it is more innovative in certain sectors, especially in software, in finance, in entertainment. But it is also deeply unequal. The wealth gap is wider than it has been in a century. The middle class is shrinking. Millions of Americans are drowning in debt, student loans, medical bills, credit cards. The infrastructure is crumbling, bridges collapsing, water systems failing, the electrical grid fragile. The education system is falling behind international standards. The political system is so gridlocked that basic investments in infrastructure or research or healthcare are nearly impossible. The government is running massive deficits. The national debt is over $30 trillion and growing, and there is no political will to address it. American society is polarized, angry, divided along lines of race, class, geography, and ideology. There are rising levels of drug addiction, suicide, violence. Trust in institutions, in government, in media, in science is collapsing. China looks at this and sees a country that is turning inward, that is losing confidence in itself, that is no longer sure it wants to lead the world or that it even can. And that creates an opening, a vacuum, that China believes it can fill. Third, China looks at the rest of the world, particularly the global south, and sees opportunity. The countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, the 88% of the world's population that does not live in the West, they are tired of being told what to do by Washington and Brussels. They remember colonialism. They remember being exploited, their resources extracted, their people oppressed. They remember the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank imposed austerity measures that destroyed their economies in the name of free market reform. They remember being lectured about democracy and human rights and the rule of law by the same countries that invaded Iraq on false pretenses, that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in the war on terror, that supported dictators when it was convenient, that imposed sanctions that starved ordinary people while the elites thrived. They are skeptical of Western moralizing. And they see China offering an alternative. China offers infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative, ports, railways, power plants, highways, built with Chinese loans and Chinese labor. China offers trade with no political conditions attached, no demands that you adopt democracy or liberalize your economy or protect human rights. China offers investment, technology transfer, and a model of development that does not require you to become Western. Many of these countries do not love China. They do not trust China completely. They worry about debt traps, about Chinese influence, about environmental damage, about labor practices. But they see China as a partner that treats them as equals, or at least pretends to, that does not condescend, that does not lecture. And in a world where the West is offering lectures and China is offering infrastructure, many are choosing China, or at least hedging their bets, keeping good relations with both sides. And that gives China leverage, diplomatic weight, a coalition of countries that will not join an American effort to isolate it. Fourth, and most importantly, China looks at the technology race and believes it is catching up, that the gap is closing, that in another decade it will reach parity or even superiority in enough critical domains to be secure. For decades, the United States had an overwhelming lead in almost every advanced technology: semiconductors, software, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, telecommunications. That lead is shrinking. China is now leading or competitive in several areas. It dominates the production of batteries for electric vehicles, controlling over 70% of global battery cell production. It dominates solar panel manufacturing, producing over 80% of the world's solar panels. It is ahead in certain applications of artificial intelligence, particularly in facial recognition, surveillance systems, and natural language processing for Mandarin. It is ahead in high-speed rail, having built the world's largest and most advanced network. It is ahead in mobile payment systems, with apps like Alipay and WeChat Pay processing more transactions than Visa and MasterCard combined. It is competitive in 5G telecommunications, with Huawei and ZTE offering equipment that rivals or exceeds that of Western competitors. Yes, China still lags in cutting-edge semiconductor design and manufacturing. Yes, it still depends on Western technology in critical areas, like advanced software, precision instruments, and certain pharmaceuticals.